I'm Anne Rohstock. A very warm welcome to the keynote panel and to my presentation entitled Educational Research as Relational and Co-Productive Slow Science. I'm really delighted to be part of this, and I am really delighted to have this fantastic opportunity to present results of my research at the ECER conference in 2021. And I consider myself really lucky to be part of this and want to thank the organization committee again for their kind consideration. This really means a lot to me. In the following 30 or 40 minutes, I would like to focus very closely on the overall theme of this year's conference, which is education and society, expectations, prescriptions, reconciliations. And I would like to explain why, in my opinion, it is indispensable for research in educational science in general, but also in the history of education in particular, because I am a trained historian, to become aware of their own exclusions and their own violent marginalizations in a reflexive self-turn, and in a second step, why it is important to undertake epistemological and research practical shifts that increasingly undermine the boundaries between science and society, but also between academic knowledge and common knowledge. Following Isabelle Stengers, Donna Haraway, Vinciane Despret, Bruno Latour, and also Orlando Falsborda, I will try to show that research in the educational sciences and in the history of education has a responsibility for the formation and also for the maintenance of pluralistic societies of the present, and why, against this background, it is important for us as educational scientists to do relational, co-productive, and collaborative research, and that this, in fact, means to slow down, to do slow science. I start my talk with a little story about apes, more precisely about baboons. I came across this story some time ago when I read Donna Haraway's book, When Species Meet, and also a book by Belgian philosopher Vinciane Despret entitled What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions? And I later on discussed these books with my students, and we all found that there is a lesson to be learned for the social sciences and the humanities in this story. In these books, Donna Haraway and Vinciane Despret describe how in 1975, Barbara Smuts, who is a North American bioanthropologist, went to Tanzania and Kenya to study chimpanzees and baboons. And initially, when she arrived, she behaved exactly as she had been taught in the scientific community at Stanford University. Smuts tried to approach her so-called objects of study, the baboons, as neutrally as possible. She had even been instructed to be like a rock, to be inaccessible and unresponsive to the primates. Good scientists, this was the opinion behind it, good scientists should make themselves invisible, so to speak, in order to be able to cultivate the objective view from nowhere and to intervene as little as possible in so-called nature. However, the baboons were more than irritated by Smuts' stone performance. Even more, they seemed downright dissatisfied with the strange creature in their midst. Why did it not return their glances? The longer Smuts persisted in her posture, the more it dawned on her that the only creature for whom this supposedly neutral scientist was invisible was she herself. After all, not interacting socially is anything but neutral. The baboons must have perceived someone, and this is what Haraway and Despret argue in their interpretation of Smuts' account. The baboons must have perceived someone pretending not to be there, and they must have wondered if they could teach this someone how to behave as a polite guest among baboons. The question with which Barbara Smuts arrived at the baboons was received by the baboons themselves. It was no longer are baboons social creators, but it was rather, does this apply to humans too? Smuts in the following began to jettison all the methods she had learned in the male scientific enterprise. I brought with me a famous photograph of the surrealist artist, writer, and lesbian Jewish resistance fighter Claude Cahun, which I think expresses this process which Smuts underwent in a wonderful way. Smuts changed almost everything about herself, from the way she walked and sat, to her posture, to the use of her eyes and the use of her voice. She transformed from a rock to an embracing human being. And in the process, she learned to be in the world in an entirely new way, that of baboons. Smuts writes, although I was still present, much of my experience overlapped with this larger feeling entity. Increasingly, the troop felt like us rather than them. The moment that baboons were able to make eye contact with Barbara Smuts, Smuts went from being an object to being a subject. Only now could she be given avid glances that indicated that she should move away. The body played a really important role in all this because it was the entity which can affix and be affixed, and because of that, it was the site for change. Haraway describes with Smuts and the baboons that this approach Smuts adopted was not about becoming the other. Haraway, as well as Vinciane Despret, reject the concept of empathy as well as the romantic notion of peaceful togetherness. And indeed, the endowed bond between Smuts and the baboons did not preclude conflict. But however, these conflicts could now be negotiated, and that is precisely the basic prerequisite for a relationship, not least for a relationship in which knowledge is to be produced, not to become the other through metamorphosis, but to become with the other. That is what is at stake here. Yeah, and now I will ask, what can we learn from the history of, from the story of Barbara Smuts and the baboons, which Donna Haraway and Vinciane Despret describe so vividly in their academic work? What does this narration about researchers and apes have to do with the education sciences and the history of education? Well, a lot, I am convinced. First of all, Haraway, Despret, but also Smuts and the baboons put a question mark behind the long-standing narrative of how academic scholars arrive at their ideas and how they produce what we call scientific facts and scientific results. For a long time now, the narrative prevailed that the especially male scientist generates his ideas and writes his texts in solitude and freedom. Only through contemplation and deep immersion in one's own cognition, controlled by the self through willpower, he would arrive qua reason at the insights that were, after all, objectively valuable for mankind. And there should not be worldly distractions, political, social influences, and he should also be in this process free from social interactions. This solipsistic narrative paid homage to methodological individualism and had a great impact over the centuries. The reverberations of this narrative can still be felt today, for instance, in pop culture representations, where predominantly male scientists of the West still cavort, embodying the world-weary, slightly autistic, and socially conspicuous nerd. Their ideas originate in the head. The preceding process of thinking is often described as a really painful act, poor in food, sleep, and comfort, and also love, which due to the privations also has a romantic heroic moment. The actual practices of research, of scientific thinking, and also of idea generation, however, have probably always been different. Thinking, research, and scientific ideas do not emerge in a vacuum. On the contrary, they are often inspired by social debates, are based on popular terminology, on popular concepts and interpretations, and often emerge from techno-social constellations and interactions. This is what Donna Haraway shows in a very unique way. Donna Haraway foregrounds the role that cultural, natural, technical, social constellations play in the process of research, in the genesis of ideas and the practices of thinking like hardly anyone else. Because in her lectures, but also in her interviews and in her academic works, she repeatedly incorporates these constellations into her remarks, for example, by pointing out with a wink, but also critically, that her scientifically working brain is a product of the millions of dollars in funding that the American government launched for the scientific technical education of girls in the way of the Sputnik shock in the late 1950s, or by emphasizing the importance that storytelling in her Catholic parental home had, or by pointing to the fact that eating together with friends or lovers, or even agility training with dogs had an impact on her research. With this, Donna Haraway draws attention, in my opinion, to two very important things. Firstly, she emphasizes the significance of joy and also of friendship for research. It is not heroic suffering, it is not asceticism, and it is not loneliness romanticized as freedom, but effective bonds and indeed pleasurable, responsible togetherness, which by no means exclude possible frictions, but what first bring forth what we call scientific facts or products of research. Secondly, it indicates that research, from the genesis of ideas to the process of thinking itself, is eminently relational. It is communal and also, in a generating sense, a material matter. Ideas from this perspective do not originate in the minds of privileged white men, but are embedded in techno-social as well as spatially, temporally, and geographically ramified material bodily practices of thought. Thinking, as Donna Haraway puts it, is nothing less than a materialist practice with other thinkers. And with this, Haraway also refers to the exclusion that modern scientific thought, modern scientific thinking has produced since René Descartes' slogan, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And as a consequence, non-Europeans, lay people, women, and also the objects at which research was directed remained excluded from the thinking process for centuries by the focus on the male, white, Western individual as the supposed sole source of scientific thought. And in a way, they are rendered invisible in research to this day. Similar to her friend and companion, Bruno Latour, who opposes both the subject-centered and anthropocentric modern thinking of the cogito with a cogitamus, we think. Donna Haraway therefore designs thinking in the plural. Thinking, but also the related practices of reading, of writing, and performing must, in her point of view, be made visible as the symbiotic, participating, and co-becoming practices that they have always been. Furthermore, it is necessary that we explicitly come together to think in order to know something in a collective effort. And this for her is the elementary prerequisite for possibly becoming, and here I quote Donna Haraway, less stupid. This also requires a certain tact, respect for the other, and as Vinciane Despret puts it, politeness, courtesy. In this way, the joint generation of knowledge presupposes a respectful and thoroughly physical sensing of the other, and it is not disembodied disinterestedness and neutrality. What a difference it makes with which attitude one enters the research process can be seen very nicely in the example of Barbara Smuts and the baboons I described at the beginning of my talk, because only when Smuts became practically involved did her practice become one that could ask relevant questions and receive correspondingly relevant answers. And in this way, questions and answers that mattered. These close and involving relationships, as also the work of Shirley Strum, for instance, and Bruno Latour shows, are not easy to form. They are based on painstaking, protracted, and small-scale work, on creative co-construction of knowledge in relation. And in this sense, establishing relationships is also not merely synonymous with knowing that we all are in one way or another connected to others, but it is an achievement. And educational science and historical educational research that relied on a similar co-constructive knowledge production would be one thing above all. It would be really, really slow, because it takes time to engage with those involved in the knowledge production, be it sources, be it texts, artifacts, animals, but also lay people, contemporary witnesses, forgotten voices, students, or other scholars. Indeed, first of all, it is important to learn to pay attention to these people and objects as relevant actors in the first place. In this sense, writing histories should always be, and here I come back to what Vinciane Despret writes, in this sense, writing histories should always be remembering. That is the remembering gathering of participants and co-producers of knowledge which have been forgotten. Vinciane Despret writes, the English term remember can make us aware of the work involved, which is not just about remembering, but about remembering in order to reassemble, to remember something. However, it does not only take time to make all these references and relationships, it also takes time to carefully lodge, perform, and also to name what is put together in this process. While Donna Haraway, Vinciane Despret, Isabelle Stengers, Bruno Latour, and many other primarily also feminist authors cultivate this way of working in an exemplary way by, for instance, including references to co-thinkers, including references to unpublished papers, never written dissertations, friends, non-academics, but also by including references to literature, to music, to art, to films in their works. And although they do it, this procedure is by no means standard in the fast academic world. Also, although I think something is beginning to change with regard to the publication practice also in the education sciences, and also I am well aware that there are very different disciplinary cultures which can be identified. Writing collectives and collaborative research groups are still rare in the educational science and the history of education, especially in the global north. You see, for instance, in appointment procedures, articles in sole authorship usually count more than joint publications. Yeah, and educational history that sees itself as a history with others should therefore, according to my plea, be inspired by a science as described by Isabelle Stengers in her brilliant book, Another Science is Possible. In this book, she argues for contrasting the male-dominated, fast-paced scientific enterprise which focuses more on efficiency than diligence and leaves no room for scruples and hesitation. She argues for contrasting this fast science, aggressive science, with a slow science. Slow science establishes active connections between collectives of academic researchers and other non-academic collectives, and no longer separates between these supposedly different spheres. Similar to how the slow food movement has shown that the interests of consumers and producers can be very common interests, slow science is about identifying common matters of concern. This is how Bruno Latour formulates it, and it is about thinking together. And this would also mean not to distinguish between science on the one hand and mere opinions on the other, or choosing only supposedly rational and objective scientific approaches to produce knowledge. Rather, she argues it is important to acknowledge the connection of science with other values. Facts and values, as well as rationality and emotionality, as also the role model Barbara Smuts shows. These are not mutually exclusive, but they are interconnected and part, so to say, of the knowledge process itself. Instead of spending time defending the supposedly real and aggressive science with its mobilizing, progressive, future-oriented thinking, we should, according to Stengers, let ourselves be affected by others. Like, for instance, Barbara Smuts by the baboons, and dare the adventure of shared relevance. And reciprocal capture is what is to be achieved in this knowledge formation process. Such retarded or slow science would be no less productive than fast science. It would just be differently productive, I think. Slow science is not concerned, and this is very important to emphasize, it is not concerned with establishing a soft-spoken, touchy-feely science in which everyone is nice to each other, but nobody produces anything. I think on the contrary, it is such a slow science is concerned through the intertwining of ethics and epistemology, of epistemic interest and politeness, not only to ask the better questions, but also to get the better, indeed more relevant answers. It would be productive, mainly in the sense that it generated new and more surprising topics, contributed to the pluralization of voices and the establishment of relationships between academic researchers and non-scientists. And as Isabelle Stengers put it, in fast and aggressive science, creativity suffers, not least because the clear demarcation between science on the one hand side and values on the other hand side cuts relations with everything non-scientific. And so, and as a consequence, new topics and ideas are as often absent as good tone. So only when science slows down and does relational work across disciplinary, but also across academic boundaries, that is when it also becomes political, when it situates knowledge rather than universalizes it, is another more civilized science possible. This is what Isabelle Stengers says. How such a slow and collaborative, relational and co-productive research and science could look like, and which role education and the history of education could play in there, we can learn from the Colombian sociologist Orlando Falsborda and adjoint researchers who did really important and fascinating research from, I think, the 1950s onwards. Orlando Falsborda, you probably all know him, became known especially since the 1970s for his engagement and involvement in participatory action research, in short PAR, in Latin America. And PAR is defined as a social science method of inquiry that seeks to dissolve the boundaries or the traditional division between research object and subject, between those who research and those who are researched. And in my opinion, PAR is rather an epistemology than a methodology. And it is an epistemology that makes porous the boundaries between science and society, between scientific theory and political as well as social practice. And most important, it also makes porous the boundaries between academic knowledge and popular knowledge. In her recently published, fascinating, brilliant book, Joanne Rappaport, who is a North American anthropologist, describes how Orlando Falsborda worked with the National Association of Peasant Users in the Córdoba region of Colombia's Caribbean coast in the 1970s. Borda and his team were concerned with improving the situation of Latin American peasants in the 1970s who had lost their land in the second half of the 20th century and were now hired out as day laborers and workers in the big cities. This improvement of situation was to be achieved in particular through the participation of peasants in research. Historical research was of particular importance in this context. Like Donna Haraway, Orlando Falsborda and also his colleagues were convinced of the transformative power of stories, not officially told, as a means of changing the present. Farmers were to rediscover forgotten or suppressed stories through historical research in archives, but also through interviews with early 20th century peasant leaders and agrarian reformers, and through a series of workshops in order to be able to revise their own present based on these stories. And it is important to see, as Jan Rappaport points out, that the so-called popular classes certainly had their own heroes, and this is becoming visible in many ways in PAR research. But the so-called popular classes did not know them because they were not mentioned by official historiography. An important element of this critical recovery of history, this is how Orlando Falsborda and team termed it, an important element of this critical recovery of history was its communication to a broad, non-scientific indigenous audience in order to create a political awareness of their own past and an awareness of belonging. Belonging was meant as belonging to a political organization, but not least also to the soil of the country. To this end, Orlando Falsborda and colleagues had founded a network of Colombian activist researchers in 1920, which also served as a publishing house and an umbrella organization, and was named, I'm sorry for my bad Spanish, I don't speak Spanish at all. It was named La Rosca de Investigación y Acción Social, which means Circle of Research and Social Action, in reference to the Colombian Spanish term for in-group. The communication of forgotten and even neglected histories with which La Rosca was entrusted, and which we should not think of as the transmission of a finished scientific product to broader social strata, was what the circle called systematic devolution. So they were concerned with the orderly return of historical knowledge into the hands of contemporary associations and grassroots organizations of indigenous people. This was done in very, very different ways. I have brought with me only two examples. An important component was narrative and pictorial representations, above all so-called mapa parlantes, speaking maps, as well as comics, which told the story of indigenous peasant leaders as graphic histories. While the maps were primarily aimed at recalling the topographical elements of indigenous past, the comics were concerned with making a past that had not been officially narrated and to make it accessible to people who could read little or not at all. The comics worked primarily with so-called composite characters, which are an important element of testimonial literature, especially in the Latin American region. And composite characters, a series of historically lived experiences, are generalized and condensed, and in a way these composite characters transcend individual actors, so that the historical narrative itself does not start with the individuals as the driving force of history. These composite characters in turn told paths that oscillated between fact and fiction. Here, but this is not the only point at which Orlando Falsborda and Donna Haraway meet, because also Donna Haraway speaks of so-called SF modes of storytelling, by which she means, or where SF is a cipher or a cipher for science fiction, but also for speculative fiction, for science fact, for string figures, or simply for so far. The graphic novels of the team around Falsborda oscillate between fact and fiction by reconstructing stories that had not been told before, and thus reinterpreting the history that had been narrated before. But these comics also left room for interpretation of the common people, of the audiences, by including gaps that could be filled in joint reflection sessions and in workshops. And in this way, the discontinuity of the comics also opened up spaces of speculative imagination that then could be filled with down-to-earth personal experiences. And here it becomes clear that the term systematic devolution, which I mentioned earlier, is also quite misleading for the readers of the scientific common sense comics, were anything but passive recipients of an already finished scientific product who were not involved in the process of producing knowledge. John Rappaport, referring to PAR researchers, makes clear that this kind of research is in fact not returned to the people, but I quote her, is disseminating work produced by the people. Fascinating in this context, I also find the concept of kitchen archives. Kitchen archives are the element of the participatory research of Orlando Falsborda and his team, in which it becomes really clear how far-reaching the researchers try to undermine boundaries between subject and object, between people and material objects, between science and common sense, between rationality and emotionality, between individual and collective, between ethics and epistemology. Orlando Falsborda described kitchen archives, and here I quote, as the documentary treasure that by chance can be found in the hands of families and towns whose members have the foresight to save historical mementos, deeds, letters, pamphlets, broadsides, all books, artistic and mechanical objects, drawings, and all photographs that can illustrate a historical era through the concrete regional expression. Joanne Rappaport in her book calls these objects indispensable elements for seizing hold of the past. And then she quotes Orlando Falsborda saying that kitchen archives furnish crucial evidence that can be transformed subsequently through a process of inference into tangible, emotionally laden and inspiring stories. Inference, according to Rappaport, is used by Falsborda to describe an interpretation or an insinuation that is made by people in a collective effort when analyzing the objects of the kitchen archives, when analyzing the objects which came out of the kitchen archives. According to Falsborda, the objects of the kitchen archives are meant to be read collectively, which requires the presence not only of the objects, but also the presence of the owners of the archives, but also of academic scholars, of researchers, and an interested public. With the term inference, then, Falsborda describes the collaborative, creative process by which the stories are elicited from objects that produce, and here I quote Rappaport again, new narratives that are based not only on empirical information, but also on popular common sense. As already seen in the case of the graphic novels, this makes it possible to experience history as a lived experience. In the comics, but also in the kitchen archives, academic research and common sense, but also thinking and feeling are thus brought together in a single process. And as a consequence, the attitudes of the participants, of the participating researchers and the grassroots participants, as Pals-Border calls the common people, are modified. So the attitudes of the researchers and the so-called common people are modified. And this connection between research and reflection, between emotion and action, is expressed in the term of the senti pensante, the thinking, feeling actor who changes the present by recourse to newly told histories. Thus, I would say participatory action research is the epitome of slowed down science as outlined by Isabelle Stengers, because not only does the combination of empirical, source-saturated research and ordinary and personal narratives and experiences require continuous, small-scale and protracted relational and exploratory work between different kinds of people, between artists, scholars, lay researchers, scientists, and activists and historical witnesses. The historical work of participatory action research is also potentially always unfinished, for it foregrounds the process of collaborative research, which is at the same time always learning. It foregrounds the process much more than the product or the outcome of the research process. Starting from different eminent local and situated forms of knowledge, a shared attitude is to be cultivated. And this is in a way similar to what Donna Haraway and Vinciane Despret described in their work, because Donna Haraway is concerned with producing responsibility in different species and a joint effort, in a joint research effort. And by that, she means the ability to respond to the others and to take care of him or her, to take responsibility. In another way, Isabelle Stengers speaks of slow research being concerned with identifying common matters of concern that make a reciprocal capture possible, whereby reciprocal relationships and values are produced. And in a very similar way, the goal of participatory action research is as much healing as it is as it has the aim of collecting information. So empirical historical research always goes together with a process of remembering, of healing, of putting things together which were not united before. Such relational, co-productive and slow research, which is at the same time a pedagogical, a social, political and scientific endeavor, could have, in my point of view, could be an important contribution in the renegotiation of public spaces as we currently witness it in the renaming of educational institutions, in the discussions about the name of streets and the toppling of monuments, which occurred all over the world. In this context, this form of slow, co-productive and relational historical research could have the task of establishing an attitude that I would like to call positive historical revisionism. And from this perspective, what is to be considered historical truth at a given point in time must be questioned again and again and collectively negotiated. In contrast to the conventional definition of historical revisionism, the reinterpretation, revision, and speculative reinvention of history is part of the core business of any honestly working historian. History, from this perspective, does not simply exist. It does not wait to be uncovered as incontrovertible truth by historians. On the contrary, our view on history is constantly changing. So new sources, for instance, can be found that cast doubt on a once constructed historical truth. Also what historians and also what the public considers significant can change, i.e. the decision about what is relevant enough to be told is not the same at any point of time. And last but not least, the way stories are told is subject to constant change because the conditions against which history is written are constantly changing too. Thus, what is considered true with regard to the past varies historically. So in my point of view, this historical revisionism seen in this way would not be dangerous. On the contrary, it would be dangerous if history could no longer be revisioned, i.e. if it could not be questioned and again narratively changed in this sense. Accordingly, things start to get dicey when history does not generate new visions, when it is not continuously reinterpreted and rewritten, when it does not tolerate radically plural narratives, but wants to homogenize and unify, when certain narratives become dominant and suppress others. In short, when history condenses into a stable edifice that makes itself immune to verifiability by the participants in the discussion, this is when it gets dicey, when it gets dangerous. In this context, a slow, relational and co-productive educational history could also be an effective antidote to current attempts to impose a hegemonic image of history on pluralistic societies that permanently blocks the path to a different future. Because if we follow Donna Haraway, it makes a difference which stories we tell each other. Writing history, once again, Belgian philosopher Vinciane Despret writes, means one thing above all. It means telling stories in such a way that the past is enabled to have another present and to have also another future. In this vision of Despret, history acquires a critical moment related to the present by designing the past differently and thus making the contingency of the present visible. By thus making the contingency of the present visible, and the seemingly self-evident formations of the present become the subject of discussion in the social, political, but also in the cultural historicity. Moreover, history is pluralized in Despret's vision. It is not history in the singular, but many histories that need to be told. Only in this way could futures be opened up that would do better justice to the plural societies of our time. Together with this, there has to be changed the multi-perspectival modes of storytelling. And these multi-perspectival modes are less concerned with having a pedagogical moral effect than with making ambitious epistemological shifts in perspectives that sensitize us to the historical fragility of current rationalities, of current order formation and institutionalizations of education. In this way, they open up the option to imagine education and the present and future differently, and are a first impulse to enrich the hitherto often one-dimensional historical narrative with, for instance, decolonial, but also diasporic, queer, or Afro-feminist perspectives. With such a relational, and here I come to the end, with that, such a relational co-productive slow science, we as educational scientists can contribute to enable, and here I quote once again Donna Haraway, we can contribute to enabling the construction of worlds through histories organized to a lesser degree by axes of domination. Yeah, thank you very much for your patience and for listening to my talk. And I'm very curious about your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.